This is the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast. Kane Pittman and Olgun Ulich talking NBL on this version of the podcast because there is two separate shows this week. If you're listening to this one and maybe you've seen on your podcast feed or the YouTube feed that there's another podcast, we did also do an NBA season preview as well and went through all the Aussies in the NBA and also Stevie Adams there in Houston as well. So for the Australians and the New Zealanders, we did a preview podcast. So if you're looking and you're wondering why maybe there is two podcasts, go check them both out this week. The NBA getting started this week, of course. Watch it all on ESPN, your home for hoops. Olgun, we thought we were busy before with the NBL and the WNBA was wrapping up, and now the NBA is going to get going. So our podcast maybe will be a little bit longer. We'll see how we work through it. But I struggled to get into the preseason hoops, and now I'm ready for the NBA to start here over the next few days.
Be honest with me. How many minutes of consecutive preseason basketball did you watch? Or did you, like me, just throw on YouTube and watch a highlight reel of some of these games?
I watched the first halves of games or first quarters, and then once the starters were out, I'm like, I don't think there's much more to watch here. So
once the fifth string guys come on and you've got low-level G League dudes on, I struggled to watch many. I watched some of the first few ones just to get an idea of who's going to be out there, what guys look like in different jerseys. But other than that, I don't know, material, I'm not really getting much out of them.
No, and of course, for the Australians in the league, go and listen to that podcast because so many faces, familiar faces in new places. So we went through all that as well. So plenty going on for the Aussies in the NBA. It's going to be a lot of fun. But there's also plenty going on in the NBL. Olgun, your news all over espn.com.au. Make sure you check it out. If you're not following Olgun on the social media channels, you're just really making a mistake. He's also on Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops every Thursday night. This week, the show leading into the New Zealand Breakers game, the early doubleheader on Thursday night this week. So make sure you check that out on ESPN, YouTube as well. You can find the show if you missed it out on it live. So go check that out. Olgun, South East Melbourne. Let's just jump straight to it. Josh King, the new head coach, is going to be announced, or it has been announced after the Phoenix won a game against Melbourne United. Please explain who Josh King is, because I know a lot of the conversations I've been having is, who did they hire? Where did they get him from? Why did they do this so quickly? So just fill in some of the blanks for the people at home.
Yeah, so this was a signing that was done before Sam McKinnon even coached a game as interim head coach. So that has to be noted. As soon as Mike Kelly was gone, he was in effect a coach in waiting. It was when Mike Kelly was fired, the news, it didn't take long for the news to come out of Turkey that Josh King and Daryl Trafficker had parted ways, right? And from what I understand, it was a mutual parting of ways. And it was understood that he was bound for the Phoenix at that point. Now, he is 39 years old, American guy. He coached in the Bundesliga the past few seasons. This was his first season in Turkey, only coached a game or two. And from what I understand, it was really interesting. When I broke the news, I got texts from a lot of different people. I got texts from different players who have either been coached by him or have been on teams against him. And the word I got was that he's an interesting character. He has unorthodox methods. He's sort of a new school, forward-looking sort of coach. And that's what you're going to get out of a 39-year-old American who's decided to go through the Euro pathway as opposed to the G League pathway. He went through college a little bit, but this is what you're going to get is this new school coach coming into this Phoenix team. He's going to coach his first game on November 1. It's a 2-year deal, so it's the remainder of this season plus all of next season. And this is the Phoenix going down that unique route. It's the route that a lot of teams are going down. The Illawarra Hawks did it with Justin Tatum. The Sydney Kings have done it with a lot of the Americans they brought in. The 36ers have Mike Wells, and this is another young American coming to the NBL, seeing if that style of basketball can fit what is this style of basketball, which is a super fast style NBA type of play style.
Yeah, no doubt. The NBL is attractive to these guys, and we've seen over the last few years, even at Chase Buford, who comes to Sydney. So I don't know enough about Josh King to even bother questioning the hire because I don't know. We're just going to have to wait and see. The one thing that is fascinating to me is just the timing of this, because we understand once you get to this period of the year, you're in October, you're heading into November, all the leagues across the world have started. So you don't have this open playing field of coaches that you can potentially hire and bring across. So there would be some logic to saying, and this might be the South East Melbourne Phoenix and why they are under pressure as a franchise, but there would be some logic to say, okay, well, Sam McKinnon did a pretty decent job in Brisbane last year, or when he was the interim in Brisbane. I know they made the decision, but he wins this first game up. We'll see how he goes over these next 2 games. But there might have been some logic to say, well, look, we're 0-5. Let's ride it out with Sam McKinnon and see how this season goes. And then when the whole coaching pool is open, if we don't think Sam McKinnon's the guy, we've got a greater class of potential coaches to bring in here. So is the timing fascinating to you? And I guess my question would be, did they have Josh King in their sights before the season even started?
Here's the thing. Right about round 2 or 3 this season, there was a rumor that started to float around. And I don't usually like to play in unsubstantiated rumors, but we have a platform and a hostage audience, so let's go for it. There was a rumor that the Phoenix had like a coach in waiting, that they were ready to unleash in round 6 or 7, assuming Mike Kelly wasn't able to get the job down. Now, Josh King is going to come in, and he's going to start coaching right around round 6 or 7. Mm-hmm. Now, so that rumor has come to fruition. Whether I'm sort of adding some drama to it for the sake of it, I don't know. That's it. It isn't logical to assume that Mike Kelly was fired and the next day the Phoenix just managed to get this coach who was under contract with a different team. That's just, no reasonable person would believe that. So there is an expectation that this guy was lined up for a considerable period of time, because you do need to speak with the guy. You need to vet the guy. That's not a one-day job, right? That takes often weeks. There was thinking that went round when Mike Kelly was fired. And I spoke to some players about it, some GMs around the league, and it's, okay, if they bring someone from the outside in, the question is, why is that person available? Now, with Josh King, they sort of avoid that question because he wasn't available, technically, officially. He was part of a Turkish basketball league team. He is highly regarded in the international community. So some stuff clearly happened in the background that this was effectively agreed to prior to Mike Kelly was fired. And look, if you're going to commit to someone for more than one season, then you're going to have to get someone who is highly regarded around the basketball community. You're not going to take someone on a whim, right? So I think the due diligence was done on Josh King before they signed the dotted line.
Yeah, no doubt. And it is, a different situation to last year with Justin Tatum, who was already there. And they did end up rolling with him through the season. He ended up getting the job a little later. So, yeah, I'm curious how Mike Kelly would feel when so soon after that decision is made, they've got their new coach. It would make you probably feel like you never stood a chance. So it's fascinating. We'll see what happens with the Phoenix over the next few weeks and for the rest of the season. Now, they were 0-5 coming into this game against Melbourne. And I want to touch on this a little bit because it was a fascinating game. And look, sometimes we discussed it last week. You expect that the Phoenix were going to have some response. You expect that this game against Melbourne United was going to be a little bit spiteful at times. It is a rivalry, even though Melbourne United have dominated this for the past few seasons and really the whole way through. But the thing that really surprised me with this game was Melbourne United, a team that I said last week on the podcast were the most predictable in terms of their just level. You know what you're going to get. It might not necessarily be exciting, but they're full of veterans. They just consistently bring it every week. And they, to me, looked completely distracted and just sucked in to this Phoenix team that was happy to get involved and happy to make the game chippy. And it was really surprising to me that Melbourne even got baited into that, whether it was Chris Golding, whether it was Rob Lowe, who over the last few weeks has been dishing out some questionable fouls, and even Jack White that was missing shots at the basket and appeared frustrated, perhaps more with himself than anyone else. But yeah, just a bizarre performance by Melbourne. I'm not too worried about it, but I was certainly surprised by what I was watching.
Yeah, because we've spoken ad nauseum about this Melbourne team, and the continuity is helpful. The fact that they're full of veterans, they should be largely unfazed. They know that there's like a connectiveness to them on both ends, and it seemed like one little thing was able to rattle them, which absolutely shouldn't happen with a team that again is disconnected and has this many veterans, guys who've just been here before. So that surprised me, and it was everything from like the chippiness of the game, whether it was Chris Golding and Geordie Hunter getting tangled up, whether it was the unsportsmanlike fouls, and then they had just trouble finishing around the rim. They had trouble finishing around the rim against Cairns a few weeks ago. They had the same thing today, and I think that just bled into the rest of the game where they had issues just with some basic stuff, right, which is just staying focused, finishing around the rim, and that bled into their defense, where I think they allowed a lot of line drives, weren't able to stay in front. And the Phoenix, which haven't been a great offensive team this whole season, put together a really good offensive performance against what should be a really good United team. And it's Shea Ely just not being there. Even from like a capacity standpoint, yeah, he's the best point of attack defender in the league, probably the best defender in the league, but also just like the guy who, when push comes to shove, when things get chippy, he's there to sort of bring everyone together. He's a leader, not necessarily with his voice, but with his actions. I think it was really clear that they missed him, and they looked a bit disconnected, which is not usual for a Vickerman team.
Yeah, I had the importance of Shea Ely down there. I also had the Dellavedova time that he spent on the sidelines, which again was a result of that chippiness and just the Melbourne United getting caught up in it. This came after the Geordie Hunter, Chris Golding incident where CG was very unhappy with getting hooked up with Geordie Hunter. We were texting at the time. I think you were more on Chris Golding's side. I thought it was pretty ridiculous, to be honest. Like, first of all, a very dangerous.
I'm not on anyone's side. I understood his grievance.
Yeah, but this is the thing. We understand that, and look online, you'll see it. The problem is when you put yourself in that position, that people just aren't going to believe you, and I think that's what we saw with that one there. And it's hard to know, sitting here from watching the replay, whether there was anything untoward. It didn't look like it on the replay to me, but then again, these guys are athletes. They're in this position, and they're also very smart. So maybe you can do something a little bit chippy under the radar that no one else can really see. So it's hard to know who was at fault there. But I thought the reaction then led to the next play where he steps into Geordie Hunter to check him roll into the basket, and then he falls on Dellavedova's leg. So it was just, again, it was completely unfortunate. It was unlucky, but that was a result of getting sucked in to what was going on the floor. So Melbourne United, just a really off day. Dellavedova looks like he's going to be okay. Shea Ely looks like he's going to miss some time. So, yeah, again, I wouldn't be too worried about Melbourne, but fascinating game, particularly with no Derek Walton, who looks like he's going to miss some time with a hamstring. You would think Melbourne were just going to go away and win that game. So they would be disappointed with that, I would say.
And this is one of the issues that a lot of people around the league are pointing to with Melbourne, which is, do they have enough creation and just general scoring? Do they have just guys who can go, like, quote unquote, get you a bucket? And if Shea Ely is sidelined for an amount of time, whatever that is, that's one of their main creators just off the table, right? That's someone who's going to get 2 feet in the paint, create advantages, and create scores. That's off the table. So this is one of the deficiencies of this United team, because they don't really have a ton of scoring or advantage creation from their bigs. They need it from all those guards. And if Shilly's out, then I'm not sure they're getting that same sort of creation from like a Flynn Cameron. They're definitely not getting that from a Joel Foxwell. So they've got to figure out where they're going to get that from, especially with Chris Golding not shooting the ball really well to start this season. They've got to figure out. It seems as though while I think they're clicking on all cylinders, they don't entirely know where their scores are coming from. That's like my feel right now with Melbourne.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting the longer the season goes, because you expect the defense will hold up. But when they get to the postseason, at times that was the problem, or it has been their problem in the postseasons in recent seasons as well. Speaking of teams that are struggling on offense, we're going to talk about Tassie a fair bit later on in this podcast. So if you're a fan of the Jack Jumpers, stick around. We've got plenty to discuss there, and potential roster moves with the Jack Jumpers. But now it is time for PointsBet Built Different. And I suggested this to you as we work through who we could potentially bring to the table here. I'm bringing the big fella, Max Darling, from the New Zealand Breakers for his performance on the weekend against the Perth Wildcats. We haven't spoke a lot about New Zealand. They've been away in the US. Max Darling had 5 points for the season coming into this game against Perth. He finishes with 15 points, 4 rebounds, 2 blocks. He knocks down 4 threes, and he was a genuine difference maker in this game. Not a player we've seen a lot in the NBL, but Max Darling, shout out to you. This was a big win for the Breakers and a massive performance from him.
Kiwi Zion.
Yes. He's solid.
Yes, is what this guy has been. There was so much promise in Max Darling when he was coming out as a junior. He went to Aussie Jack and played in Europe, and he just hasn't been able to put it together. It's a mixture of opportunities, injuries have just held him back. But this is his breakout game. This was him hitting corner threes, him being a point of attack defender, guarding Christian Doolittle, who is emerging as one of the tougher guards in the NBL purely because of how big and strong he is. But if there's any player in the league who's going to match up with him from a physicality standpoint, from a mobility standpoint, it's maybe Max Darling. And we saw that they met it at the apex for a block. A few possessions later, Max Darling stayed in front of him, moved his feet really well. He's doing all the little things. A lot of people are questioning why Petteri Koppinen was sticking with Max Darling in that starting lineup. He was just there as like a token. All right, you're our quote unquote 3-and-D wing who didn't really do any of those things. He did both of those things against Perth, and the hope is that he can continue to do that going forward.
Yep, credit to Max Darling, credit to the New Zealand Breakers. That was a big win. They're 3-1 in the season. That was PointsBet built different.
What are you really gambling with? For free and confidential support, call the number on the screen or visit the website.
You're listening to the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast, Kane Pittman and Olgun Ulrich. We did just discuss Max Darling and the New Zealand Breakers. I still want to see a bit more from this New Zealand team before I come to any big conclusions of where they're at. They've only played 4 games so far. The Perth Wildcats, though, 2-4 in the season. Before we even get into this anymore, Bryce Cotton very early in this game, pretty innocuous incident, but looked very, very painful. He tried to still get up and down the floor for a few possessions before ultimately just collapsed into the floor in pain, holding his sort of chest, rib area. Is there any further detail on this? Because based on what we've seen from this Perth Wildcats team, if they don't have him, they are in some real trouble over the next few games or weeks.
From what I was told, the X-rays came back negative, right? So no broken ribs, no cracked ribs, which is good news. The problem, though, is that he was in considerable pain, obviously, after that game and when he came from the hospital. And he still is in some pain. So I think they're getting further tests to figure out what exactly is causing the issue here. Because it looked like a pretty generic broken rib situation where it's hampering him. But if it's not that, then I wonder what it is. Is it a lung issue? Is it a cartilage thing around those ribs? We have to wait and see. My expectation is that he will miss some time. I don't think this is like a little knock or a minor injury that's going to keep him out for one game. My feel is that he will miss a few games. And like you said, if that's the case, the fact that Keanu Pinder hasn't brought much output for this team, Dylan Windler hasn't looked close to what we thought he'd be for this team and what John really wants him to be for this team. Ty Webster was great last game, but if Ty Webster is your best player, I don't think that's going to win you games consistently in the NBL. Without Bryce, the nucleus of that team, I don't know if this Wildcats team can function and win consistently.
And we're going to continue to talk about it right through the season. I think if you're the Wildcats, you want to win this season or put yourself in a position to win. We're sitting around waiting for Bryce Cotton. I know there's been different reporting elsewhere. I'm certainly hearing potential overseas offers as well. I mean, there's going to be people coming for Bryce Cotton. And if you're a Perth Wildcats fan, you can't imagine watching this team without the guy who, before this injury, was on track for his 8th scoring title. They just extended John Riley. This feels like a situation that they can turn around because Pinder should be better. I don't know why he's having 5 field goal attempts in 21 minutes. The whole situation continues to be bizarre. Dylan Windler, I think, has done some really nice things, but he has not found his outside shot. He was 0 for 8 from 3 in this game. They only lose by 4 points, so it's on the margins. They easily could have won that game on a night where you're expecting to have Bryce Cotton. He plays 2 minutes. So if they had won that game, you say, okay, if we were without Bryce, we can at least prepare for that this week. So they just missed out. So I'm not saying that they are going to miss the postseason. I still like the team on paper, but it does feel like just in general, this is a situation that if it doesn't turn in the next few weeks, it could get a little nasty.
Yeah. So I got 3 things. One, when Bryce goes down very early in the game, Elijah Pepper getting sub 10 minutes feels weird to me. He's someone who I think would be getting 20 minutes on another team. So not finding minutes for him, I don't know what the go is there, but I feel like they absolutely could have used that sort of offensive output. Do you remember a few weeks ago when John Riley signed that extension and I came on Nothing But Net and I flagged this? I said, keep an eye on this Bryce Cotton extension because nothing's imminent and that's concerning. Now, obviously, since then, a lot of things have come to the fore on Bryce. Probably not going to come to an agreement on an extension this season. The feel is, there's an easy line to draw, which is Trevor Gleeson is in Chiba. Chiba has heaps of money. And if Bryce isn't going to be in the NBL, and if he's going to be a one-club guy in the NBL, then Chiba exists. And that's an easy connection. Bryce is 32, 33. He's got to maximize whatever he has left as a high-level player in international basketball. So then the other question becomes, and I don't want this to be hijacked by a complete Bryce Cotton conversation, but Bryce Cotton on your salary cap is effectively half your salary cap. Because he's not Australian, you can't marquee that contract. So that's a lot of money to spend on one player. Now, you're going to spend money on one player. Bryce Cotton is the guy to do that for, and its success has been proven. But if they do lose Bryce Cotton, there is some flexibility that you have there. They're going to be off Bryce Cotton's contract. They're going to be off Keanu Pinder's contract. That's effectively an entire salary cap there. So they have the opportunity to be more flexible with their recruitment if Bryce isn't there. Now, ideally, Bryce is there, but in a situation where this season is redeemable in some fashion and John really stays on, which we're assuming he will, then it's not all doom and gloom if you do have to build a team without Bryce, because you do have basically a blank slate to build a team with a ton of money.
I would personally like to applaud you, Olgun, because if you're a Wildcats fan and you're listening to this podcast and you're really thinking doom and gloom, if we lose Bryce Cotton, this would be the worst case scenario. You just presented a real positive spin on losing one of the greatest players of all time, who is still very clearly in his prime and looks like he's got a couple more seasons of that left. So, hey, that was nice work.
You got to look on the bright side. This is the Wildcats spend the most money in the NBL. So much of that goes to Bryce Cotton. You can't marquee that. Go and get an Australian who you can then marquee, or go and you can get 2 high-level imports with the amount that you pay Bryce. Again, losing Bryce is never the ideal scenario. Let's make that very clear. The preference, number one, is to keep Bryce. But in the chance that you don't, there are different avenues you can go down where it doesn't completely ruin your team, and you can make it still a very functional, winning championship level team without him.
It's going to be a story to watch, and the Wildcats, we saw last year, had a little bit of a slow start as well. So again, 2-4. We're not even a quarter of a way through the season, and they nearly won that game. Who saved them though? Well,
they dropped in that hole, and then Bryce went nuclear.
Yes.
If there's no Bryce, I'm concerned.
Yeah, if he's missing 4 or 5 games, then you can find yourself, and you might be, 3-7 or 3-8. Then you're in some trouble. But if he only misses 1 or 2, I think they can probably still turn this thing around. The Wildcats have Sydney on Friday night on ESPN. That's going to be a must-watch game. It's in Perth. Those two teams, let's say, don't like each other, so it'll be interesting. But with no Bryce Cotton, you would think that Sydney would go in favourites in that game. I mentioned earlier in the podcast that we're going to talk about the Tassie Jack Jumpers, who are struggling at this point in time, it's fair to say. I thought they battled pretty hard on the weekend against Adelaide in particular, and they had a lead against Sydney. But in that Adelaide game, it was that early lead. They were looking pretty good, and then that third quarter where Adelaide were right there, and it looked like they were about to break them, and Tassie were just holding on. But as I'm watching the game, I'm like, damn it, there's still a quarter and a half to go. This is too early for Tassie to be fighting for their life. And in the end, they got overwhelmed. But the offense has been a problem. I don't necessarily think personnel-wise they've been at their best defensively. I thought Majuk Deng was put in a really difficult position against Adelaide to get monstered on the defensive end. So it feels like something's missing. I know we've discussed Jack McVeigh. Clearly, that's the big piece that's not there. But just currently, in terms of the depth and the roster and the rotations, it feels like they're in a tough spot to try and keep pace with the top teams in the league.
Yeah, the Majuk Deng things confused me so much. Fabian Krislovic had a DMP that game. The entire 36ers offense was throwing it into Majuk Deng, into Montrezl Harrell, and allowing him to exploit the size difference against Majuk Deng. You have Fabian Krislovic right there, who's a very solid defender in the NBL. Why is he sitting there? Right? Put him on the floor. And I get whatever, and especially if Majuk Deng is not going to give you whatever offense you expect him to give you, which he wasn't in this game. So that confused me from a coach's decision perspective. The offense for this team has been real bad. And that's like a personnel thing. They just don't have the guns. They don't have the weapons to score consistently. And it feels like every Jack Jumpers game, they can be either leading by a small margin or they could be just in the game, and you just know they're going to go through a 3 or 4 minute stretch where they just can't put the ball in the hole. Where even as much as they go through their process and they're one of the best teams of getting through their sets, you just know that they're not going to be able to get execution at the end of it. And it's because I don't think they have the offensive weaponry to do that. I have reporting at ESPN that they are speaking internally, this franchise, about pulling a lever of some sort, whether that's getting off Ruben Tarangi, whether that's getting off Craig Sword. We have to see what that looks like. They were holding out hope that maybe Jack McVeigh, if he didn't get that deal with the Rockets, or if he didn't stay with the Rockets on that two-way, that they can maybe go get him. It looks like that's going to happen. I don't think McVeigh's people were ever preparing for that either. But it just feels like Craig Sword is a great enough player in whatever he is good at, but unfortunately, that's just not the need of the Jack Jumpers right now. As soon as Jack McVeigh left and as soon as Sean McDonald went down, they needed some scoring, they needed some creation. They just don't have that, and they have to go and find that sooner than later because they've lost 3 in a row. It doesn't look like this offense is getting any better.
So it's interesting because Tassie, in general, you look at the top 3 players, so Doyle, Crawford, Magnay, and the offensive numbers now, they're nowhere near where they were last year. But if you're just looking at overall offensive rating, so right now the Jackies are down at about 98, which is deplorable. Like that is horrific. Like, I don't care how good your defense is, you're just not going to be able to compete, particularly with how good the top offenses are across the league. But if you just look purely with their best players on the floor, so with Magnay on the floor, they have an offensive rating of 106. That's still not elite. But if you have a really good defense, that can mean that you're really competitive. With Doyle, it's a 105. The problems are when they go to the rotation, they are stuffed right now because the numbers with Lockie Barker on the floor, with Tarangi on the floor, even Steindl, who is a complimentary piece and he knocks down threes. We saw him hit a couple on the weekend. And then that man, Krislovic. And I think that's part of the problem. That's why Scott Roth is saying, look, we can't just be an elite defense right now. We just need to hope that these guys are going to knock down shots. I'm going to start Majuk Deng because we need him to hit the threes. He didn't, as you pointed to. But I think their top players, they're still there. And the funny thing about Craig Sword is that he's actually the only player on this Jack Jumpers team on the season that has a positive plus minus. He's the only guy in this whole entire roster. I think he's a good NBL player. And I think that he is. He would be, think about this, like with Sydney, with Bull Qual, Illawarra, with Wani Swakula Bullock, Adelaide with Sunday Detch. Like, he's that guy. But the problem is this team has more serious needs elsewhere. So you can talk about cutting Tarangi, but to me, you need to use the spot that is most valuable, and that's the import. So I think Sword is a good player. I just think it's going to be an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, so the numbers are really tricky right now because Sword, so they put him on that in the game at the end of the Sydney game, and I think they went on a little run with him on the floor. It's the same with I look at, like, for example, Brisbane's offensive numbers. They look reasonable, but I feel like that they are largely fake because that's like 3 fourth quarter comebacks against like third stringers. Like, it's not third stringers, against a team that had taken the foot off the gas. So there are some numbers here that still feel a little bit pretend right now, and I feel like the Craig Sword numbers might be a bit. But I agree, he's a good basketball player.
But if he's the only guy, like if that was the case where it was junk time lineups, then there would be someone else that also has been in those junk time lineups. There isn't, and I don't watch Craig Sword and go, wow, geez, he's not he takes defensive assignments. He just does what you need him to do on offense. He's not an offensive player. He didn't come here with that purpose. And you wrote about it on ESPN.com.au that when they brought him here, they thought they were going to have Jack McVeigh. So then he would have been that complimentary guy. But now the needs have just changed.
I agree. He doesn't. Again, we can say it ad nauseum. He is a good basketball player, and he could fill a need for another team or for what this Jack Jumpers team was supposed to be. It's just not what this team is right now. They need a scoring punch. They need someone who can come in and create, because I don't think Will Magnay's at that level that he's going to take that leap and be this high level scorer. I think he's your defensive star and elite offensive role player. They just need another scoring punch. And I don't know positionally. I don't know what they need. Do you just go get a 4-man because it's the easy fit? You just the like for like replacement for McVeigh. But yeah, they need to do something. And I know that they're coming together this week to discuss what they could potentially do, who they could potentially move. Because again, when you say deplorable, that offensive rating, I went through the numbers and I was on Spatial Jam and I was going through year by year. When was the last time someone had a defensive rating this low? It was back in the 2002, 2003 season. So over 20 years ago was the last time that someone had this bad an offense. Yes, that was over the course of an entire season. And this is just 5 or 6 games in, but they're tracking right now to have the worst offense in over 20 years.
Yeah, so they were the 8th ranked defense when they made the grand final in NBL 22, but even this offense is worse than that one currently. So, we'll see if they can turn it around. And by the way, it's a nice time of year, if there was ever a nice time of year, to be looking for potential import replacements, because, a whole bunch of guys have just got cut from NBA preseason rosters. So, maybe there are some guys out there that want to come out and they're like, oh, Montrezl Harrell's having an Australian summer. That seems very nice. Let's go out there and hang out in Tassie in the summer. Beautiful place to be. So we'll see what happens with the Jack Jumpers, because if we look at the league across it right now, I see Illawarra, who quite high.
Are you a fan of the Illawarra, the Hawks of Illawarra?
I like them. I think they go back to last
not
week's podcast, about the 30-minute mark, I believe. I really got into the Hawks, but I like what they're doing. And I like that they won a game where things didn't go well on the weekend as well. But then also you got Melbourne United, you got the Sydney Kings that are right there. So that's 3 teams. Adelaide, I think, are going to get better the longer the season goes. They just had their first game with Jarrell Martin. So, Adelaide, maybe you're in the mix for that 4th team. So, spots for the play-in are going to be tight. So you probably don't want to fall too far behind. That's why we talk about the Wildcats, and that's why we talk about this team, Tassie, here as well. And New Zealand fans, I just haven't seen enough yet, but you're 3-1, so you're putting yourself in position. So it's going to be a tight run to the postseason for sure.
Yeah. Do you feel like I was trying to figure out why, how do I word this? The best teams this year, right? They're not as clear as other years, I don't think, right? Every team has like a little deficiency. Whoever the best teams are this year, do they come close to beating, let's say, the Jack Jumpers or United of last year, or the Kings or the Breakers the season prior to that, or the Kings or either the Wildcats or Jack Jumpers the season prior to that? It feels as though the best team in the league over the past few seasons were like clearly elite, whereas this season feels like the parity. It feels like the entire sort of like quality of the league is just like taken like a notch down, where like the level seems like a slightly down. And I don't know, and it could be sample size. It could be the fact that less fouls are being called. It could be that teams are trying to run more. It could be completely anecdotal and circumstantial based on shots going in and not going in and things like that. But I'm curious what you think. The best teams don't feel like they're super high level, right? Outside of maybe Illawarra right now.
Well, what I would say is, if you go back to listen to our podcast at this time of year last year, so think about the teams that made the Final Four. Illawarra, terrible. They're about to fire their coach. The Perth Wildcats started off very slow before they went on that run with Bryce Cotton that you mentioned. You had Melbourne United, who we thought were pretty good, so that wasn't too much of a surprise. And then Tassie, we would go back and forth every single week because I was like, this is sustainable. And you were saying, I'm not so sure it is. So all I'm saying is that if you go back through the years, even the Sydney Kings, when they won the first title with Chase Buford, they started off slow. They were a team that people were questioning after 6-7 weeks. So maybe it feels like there's still teams that are figuring it out. Adelaide's had a lot of turnover. But I think it's pretty normal. I think that by the time we get to Christmas, we'll have a clearer indication of where these teams sit. But no, I don't know if I agree. I think this is what we do every year at this time. Yeah,
okay. And I look at the Sydney Kings, for example, and it's a team that a lot of us, including us, think that is going to be a high level team. And they're winning games, they're 5-2, but there's still things that are clearly not clicking. No. You're right. And so I think we trust that it will. I think we trust the personnel, we trust the coaching, but it's just not completely clicking on all cylinders just yet. And maybe that's just what it is. It's just teams are slowly coming together. And like you said, once we hit Christmas, we'll see more continuity among all the teams. And it's the same with United, who seemingly show up every second game, and it's Illawarra, who I think have been quite solid. But there are like little things here and there. So I agree with you. I'm giving it grace, right? But it's something that I think is worth just tracking right now. But it could very well just be an every season thing. At this time of year, it's like, teams are figuring their stuff out. Our podcasts aren't perfect now, but come Christmas, we're gonna be bloody firing.
Yeah, and it's upsets as well. You have the Phoenix that beat Melbourne. You have Brisbane that now wins a couple of games. So unexpected results sometimes clouds that. But I think overall it's a pretty competitive league. Although I do think that those top teams will separate a little bit over the next couple of months. Let's wrap this up. I mentioned it at the top. If you're listening to this first, go to your podcast feed. There's an NBA season preview podcast there for you to listen to as well. So make sure you check that out. The NBA season getting underway this week. Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops Thursday night, which is leading you in to an NBL doubleheader on Thursday night on ESPN. So make sure you watch that show. Ryan Brockhoff will be in studio. Olgs will have the news headlines, and we'll have some other guests on that show as well. So make sure you check that out. A little bit of an early start because of the early game in New Zealand. So if you don't catch it, if you're still at work, go to YouTube after. You should be able to find the full episode there to catch up on everything that's going on. Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops. It's a fun show, and it's been good to get into that so far. Olgun has been outstanding. He's been on fire. So, Olgs, just for transparency's sake, we've still got another podcast to do. We're about to chat NBA. So let's grab a drink of water and reconvene in a few minutes.
Beautiful. I'll see you then, man.
All right. Thanks for listening. This was the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast. Kane Pittman and Olgun Ulich. We'll speak to you next time.